spent the last 8 months learning a lot about bankruptcy, which sounds boring because most people's conception of bankruptcy is very flawed. I've realized that bankruptcy is incredibly misunderstood.
They ask you how you are, you just have to say that you're fine.
The truth is, bankruptcy is ground zero for ways in which the system is rigged. The ways in which wealthy people, well-connected insiders run a scheme that ultimately ends up hurting everyday people. But because people think bankruptcy is boring, because it seems so arcane and legalese and like it happens in courtrooms where some dude in the corner is about to fall asleep.
I was maybe asleep one time.
That's partly why they're able to get away with it. Because nobody is paying attention. Well, I'm paying attention now. And after this, I hope you are too. Because nobody embodies this fucked up system more than the Sackler family.
The Sackler family.
Purdue Pharma, that's the manufacturer of the opioid OxyContin.
Killed more than 600,000 Americans.
The head of the multi-billion-dollar opioid empire and Purdue Pharma.
They were mismarketing it. It really was all about profit.
The Sackler family played the long con when it came to bankruptcy, endeavoring to use the law and use the system to avoid accountability for any criminal behavior.
The Sacklers have not been charged.
And preserve their vast, multi-billion-dollar opioid empire.
I'm profoundly sorry.
I am deeply and profoundly sorry.
There's nothing that I can find that I would have done differently.
And that is what we are talking about today. Welcome back to the Carly P. Riley Show. I'm Carly P. Riley. Meet the Sacklers. Arthur Sackler was a doctor and an entrepreneur who brought his younger brothers Mortimer and Raymond into every venture he started, including in the 1950s when he bought a little company called Purdue Pharma. Now, you may have heard of Purdue Pharma. It is the pharmaceutical company behind OxyContin, the highly addictive opioid medication that for years was marketed by Purdue Pharma and by the Sackler family as being non-addictive.
Less than 1% of patients taking opioids actually become addicted.
Just a little lie that led to millions of opioid deaths around the world. And to understand how cunning the Sacklers are and how strategically they tried to use the bankruptcy system, you need to understand a little bit more about them. The Sacklers are one of the richest families in the world. They are worth about $11 billion. And they have used that tremendous wealth to put their names on everything. And I mean literally everything. If it is not nailed down, the Sacklers have put their name on it. From universities and university buildings to museums and museum wings and staircases and gardens. I mean, truly everything. There is a Wikipedia entry just called List of Things Named After the Sacklers. Now, I don't know about y'all, but I was raised that you should give money anonymously because the point of donating money is not for other people to know that you have donated money. It's not about getting validation. It's not so that your friends in Aspen know that you are good. The Sacklers clearly weren't raised in that environment. And what their giving strategy tells me is that they very much care about what their friends in Aspen think.
They're the finest freestyle skiers in the world.
They want the whole world to know that they have money and they're good people and they care about the status. And for a family like that, losing that status is the most painful thing that can happen. The Sacklers have all the money they will ever need. They will never have to worry about feeding their children or putting a roof over their head. They can put many, many roofs over their many heads. What they worry about, I believe, is their good name. Now, to some extent, the Sackler name has already been dragged through the mud. In fact, you even have some universities who are removing the Sackler name from their buildings because of everything that has come out about Purdue Pharma and the Sacklers in the last several decades. But what the Sacklers have never been put through is a trial. A discovery process alongside a court proceeding. Something that may turn up additional, incredibly damning information, sordid details about the ways in which the Sacklers may or may not have been involved in all of the horrible things that Purdue Pharma did. And this, I believe, is something that the Sacklers would dearly like to avoid, perhaps above all else. And so, in 2008, they hatched a plan. 2008, generally speaking, was not a very good year. You know, you had that financial crisis ricocheting around the country and the world. But 2008 was an especially not very good year for Purdue Pharma. For over 10 years, Purdue Pharma and the Sackler family, by extension, had been marketing their wonder drug OxyContin as non-addictive.
You know you make me want to sell OxyContin, sell every day now.
addictive. And 2008 was the year that the Justice Department finally caught up with them. As punishment for their lies and years of horrible illegal marketing, the Justice Department fined Purdue Pharma $600 million. And they also fined 3 individual Purdue Pharma executives millions of dollars personally. But notably, none of the Sackler family members were fined as part of this. And the DOJ agreed not to go after the Sacklers personally if Purdue Pharma agreed to a compliance program. This basically means that Purdue Pharma agreed not to break the law anymore and not to do any other illegal marketing shit, and there was a whole plan put in place around that, which I don't really understand because I thought the law was just the thing that kept you from doing that. But apparently this is very common. And also, just as an aside, Purdue Pharma absolutely continued to do illegal marketing shit for years after this, but we'll get back to that. Now, despite the fact that the Sackler family had managed to escape the Justice Department's wrath, they clearly saw the writing on the wall. They had been in business with OxyContin now for, again, over a decade, and they had done very well for themselves. But their company was and would continue to be propped up by drug addicts, drug addiction, and illegal marketing schemes. And so the Sacklers likely realized that they were at risk of losing everything. Their company, their cash cow, and perhaps most importantly to them, their good sterling name if they were put through some sort of lawsuit. So they made a very critical decision. The Sacklers set a plan in motion in which step 1 was to extract and hoard as much of Purdue Pharma's wealth for themselves as possible and to hide it away in offshore accounts where it could never be accessed through lawsuits or other regulatory legal means. And step 2 was to drive the company into bankruptcy, whereby it would shut down and take all of the legal liability and Sackler family risk along with it.
I declare bankruptcy!
Of course, I don't know the Sackler family personally, so I can't speak to the exact moment that this plan was hatched, or even that it was hatched quite as neatly and specifically as I just laid it out. Though I think it is entirely possible that it was, because what I do know is that what I just described is what transpired. Prior to 2008, the Sackler family took about 15% of Purdue Pharma's revenue every year for themselves. This was a private company. The Sackler family owned it. They could do whatever they wanted. So prior to 2008, they took about 15% of Purdue Pharma's revenue for themselves every year. After 2008, the Sackler family began taking 70% of Purdue Pharma's revenue, not profit, revenue, every year and squirreling it away into offshore accounts. Now, I'm not a mathematician, but I do know that if you take 70% of a company's revenue year over year, you will drive that company into the ground. And for over 10 years, between 2008 and 2019, the Sackler family bled Purdue Pharma dry. All the while, Purdue Pharma, in violation of its compliance program, continued to do illegal marketing shit. This time giving kickbacks to doctors who prescribed OxyContin, thereby essentially illegally bribing doctors to overprescribe a deadly, highly addictive opioid medication.
Stop it. Get some help.
Now, of course, there were lawsuits that followed once this happened. The Justice Department and others realized that Purdue Pharma was breaking the law, and I believe there were over 2,500 lawsuits at one point filed against Purdue Pharma and the Sacklers. But by that point, essentially all the money was gone. The Sackler family had taken it for themselves, and Purdue Pharma was bankrupt. Now, this is something that's incredibly important to understand. As soon as Purdue Pharma declared bankruptcy, all the litigation against it was paused. Those 2,500 lawsuits paused. And Purdue Pharma went from being a defendant in lawsuits to a debtor. And a debtor in bankruptcy has a tremendous amount of power. Now, among the folks who run a debtor entity in a bankruptcy is always a big law firm. In fact, there are basically a handful of big law firms that run all of the bankruptcies in this country. And they make millions of dollars, literally hundreds of millions of dollars in some cases. In the case of Purdue Pharma, there are 2 big law firms who both made like $200 million each. And they are also given a tremendous amount of latitude to make any number of decisions. I want to give you an example outside of even Purdue Pharma. So many years ago, a private equity firm called Sun Capital bought Friendly's. Folks may remember Friendly's. It was a fast casual restaurant. If you grew up in Vermont in 2006, it was the hot place to be on a Friday night. And in 2007, Sun Capital bought Friendly's and then very quickly pushed it into bankruptcy. Now, why would it buy a company and then push it into bankruptcy? Well, by putting it into bankruptcy, Sun Capital was able to offload $110 million of pension obligations, basically $110 million worth of Friendly's debt. They were able to offload that to a quasi-government agency called the PBGC, the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation. And then Sun Capital had one of its other subsidiaries buy back Friendly's, out of bankruptcy, now free and clear of this $110 million in debt. Now, as a result of this, the $6 billion private equity firm didn't have to pay the $110 million in debt to the retirees. Other pensioners who pay into the PBGC ended up footing the bill for Friendly's pensions. Now, on its face, this seems ridiculous and why would this be allowed to happen? And part of it is that debtors have so much power in bankruptcy. They're given a lot of latitude to use their business judgment to make decisions. And in this case, the law firm and the individuals who were running the Friendly's bankruptcy were in cahoots with Sun Capital, who wanted things done this way, the private equity owners. And this is so critical to understand because this comes up over and over again in bankruptcy, which is there are all these different players who, in theory, are independent from one another or should be independent from one another. But the reality is they're working together in any number of different ways. And by the way, the head of the PBGC, the quasi-government agency that ended up having to take on this $110 million in pension debt, the head of that organization fought back in court and tried to keep this from happening, but he lost. And one thing he said in the aftermath of this was, quote, "In many cases, financial institutions and financial markets have outstripped both the law's ability to comprehend them and bankruptcy court's ability to preserve fair treatment of other constituencies in the face of them." Basically, he was saying these law firms and these private equity firms and wealthy individuals who go into bankruptcy, cough, cough, frickin' Purdue Pharma and the Sackler family, they have these judges in bankruptcy courts outgunned. And it means they're able to do essentially whatever the hell they want. And within the context of our story today, I bring this all up to say the Sackler family, and certainly their lawyers, realized that Purdue Pharma would have a hell of a lot more power as a debtor than it would have as a defendant. And I would argue that was a crucial part of their plan. Bleed this company dry so that they could declare bankruptcy and become a debtor. But it's what the Sackler family did once Purdue Pharma was a debtor that I think is most sinister. The final piece of the puzzle in preserving the Sackler family's wealth and whatever was left of their status and good name. Once the company declared bankruptcy, Purdue Pharma struck a deal with the Sackler family, their owners, the people who masterminded this whole thing, in all likelihood. And the Sackler family would pay $6 billion, which sounds like a lot until you realize they're worth $11 billion, pay $6 billion of their $11 billion fortune to Purdue Pharma, the bankrupt entity, which they would then distribute out for opioid abatement programs. It would go to victims and their families. It would settle lawsuits, et cetera, et cetera. But in exchange for these $6 billion, the Sackler family would get full releases, essentially full legal immunity from any civil lawsuits that might be brought by any victims of Purdue Pharma and the Sacklers. Now, this is called a third-party release, and it's not a release of Purdue Pharma, the debtor entity that is bankrupt. It is a release for a third party that is very much not the debtor and very much not bankrupt. The Sackler family have $11 billion. It makes sense to give a release to a bankrupt entity, but $11 billion, and they would also get a full legal release via a bankruptcy court on behalf of all of these individual victims who may or may not sign off on this. This is a very unique power within the bankruptcy system, and it would have completed the Sackler plan as far as I'm concerned. It was a huge part of the draw, I imagine, to bankruptcy. Purdue Pharma made as much money as possible by illegally pushing their opioids. The Sacklers then took that money for themselves and socked it away where it was very difficult to access. Then they used that money as leverage to strike a deal that would leave them with $5 billion and the assurance that they would never face civil litigation. And the Sacklers very nearly got away with it. They had filed their bankruptcy, the bankruptcy of Purdue Pharma, I should say, in White Plains, New York, even though the company was actually headquartered in Connecticut. And this is what's known as forum shopping. It's very common in bankruptcy. You basically pick the jurisdiction that will be most favorable to you, you think, when you file your bankruptcy. And in White Plains, New York, there's a bankruptcy judge named Judge Drain, who is known for being very friendly and sympathetic to third-party releases. Again, you could argue that that is proof that all of this was somewhat premeditated. Now, Judge Drain happily approved the bankruptcy plan in which the Sackler family would pay the $6 billion and in exchange get full legal immunity. And it's worth mentioning, perhaps, that there are good reasons for third-party releases. The thinking on them is, look, this money, the Sacklers' money, is on these offshore accounts. It's going to be very difficult to access that money through lawsuits, through litigation. And so $6 billion is more money than will ever otherwise likely be recovered from the Sacklers. And if you use this third-party release, we'll be able to recover more money than we would otherwise. And so it's a practical tool, some would say. You might be able to tell I don't share this view. And fortunately for me, neither does the Supreme Court.
Is there something wrong with you?
I said the Sackler family almost got away with it, but they didn't. They were stopped by the Supreme Court, who, in a 5-4 ruling back in June, decided that third-party releases of this kind, these kind of non-consensual blanket third-party releases approved by a bankruptcy court, those are illegal. And as far as I'm concerned, this is an acknowledgement, explicit or otherwise, that there is already an overconcentration of power in the hands of debtors, which basically means an overconcentration of power in the hands of a few big law firms and their very wealthy friends. And by the way, this is all before we've even really talked about the unbelievably incestuous, problematic relationships that abound within every bankruptcy dynamic that I have observed. In the case of Purdue Pharma, Judge Drain, who made the decision to approve the third-party releases, Judge Drain, who oversaw this whole case originally, he left the bench. He stopped being a judge in 2022. What did he do instead? He didn't retire. No, he went and worked for Skadden & Arps. Now, Skadden & Arps is the law firm that ran the Purdue Pharma bankruptcy. So Skadden & Arps stood in front of Judge Drain and said, hey, we should give the Sackler family a release. Judge Drain sat there and said, yep, great. And then 3 years later, he quit and went to work for Skadden & Arps. But Skadden & Arps, it gets worse. They worked for Purdue Pharma back in 2010. In fact, they were the law firm that was appointed to design and oversee the compliance program that Purdue Pharma entered into with the Justice Department. The compliance program that Purdue Pharma violated like crazy for years. So Skadden & Arps failed to hold Purdue Pharma and the Sackler family to account for years. And they were rewarded by getting to run the Purdue Pharma bankruptcy in which they made $200 million. And then Judge Drain went and worked for them. It's all just a big happy family. And by the way, this is just a drop in the bucket. I've been covering the FTX bankruptcy for 8 months now. And Sullivan & Cromwell is the law firm running the FTX bankruptcy. But they were also a law firm that worked for FTX US. FTX US's general counsel was Ryan Miller. Now, interestingly, Ryan Miller was previously a partner at Sullivan & Cromwell. Ryan Miller has been granted a release for any crimes he may have done pre-bankruptcy by Sullivan & Cromwell while they're running this bankruptcy. Even though many people think that Ryan Miller may have been complicit in some of FTX's crimes, Sullivan & Cromwell has granted him a release, and why wouldn't they? Ryan Miller basically got them this job where Sullivan & Cromwell is now making $200 million. I could literally do this all day. I'm gonna give you one more that really riles me up. I promise I'm not gonna go all day. Dave Brandon. He was the CEO of Toys R Us when Toys R Us went bankrupt. 3 days before Toys R Us went bankrupt, he was paid $2.8 million by Dave Brandon. Dave Brandon was paid $2.8 million in a bonus by Dave Brandon because Dave Brandon was running the company. 3 days later, he files for bankruptcy, and he uses the bankruptcy as an excuse to slash the severance payments to the 33,000 Toys R Us employees who were owed severance payments. They got $2 million between them, split between them, while he got a $2.8 million bonus prior to the bankruptcy. Now, he was able to do this because, of course, he was an insider who knew exactly what the timing of the bankruptcy would be. Now, this is crazy, and in theory, that $2.8 million could have been clawed back after the bankruptcy was declared. But who would have been the ones to call him back? Well, first of all, the law firm running the bankruptcy, but they were hired by Dave Brandon. He's the reason they're making $80 million running this bankruptcy, so they're probably not going to go after his $2.8 million bonus. The other people who could maybe complain would be the shareholders of Toys R Us, but those are the private equity companies that, by the way, installed Dave Brandon as the CEO of this company. My point is this. There is a cabal. There is a cabal of insiders and wealthy lawyers and bankers and judges and law firms, and they are running all of this shit. And they are cozy and comfortable with one another, and conflicts of interest abound. And the problem is, it's not conflicts of interest in ways that are always necessarily legally actionable. I mean, I think, frankly, in many cases, they potentially are, but the people who would hold them legally accountable are kind of in on it. But it's not such explicit, like, grease in your palms kind of negotiations. It's general relationships and the inevitable ways in which those relationships play out when people have money. But all of this creates a dynamic in which you have individuals, or in the case of Purdue Pharma and FTX, literally victims, who are on the outside of the system screaming into what feels like a void for whatever it is that they want. Meanwhile, these cabal of insiders are sitting there lighting each other's cigars and patting each other on the back and whispering in hushed tones and making the decisions for everyone else. I think first and foremost of the families of dead opioid victims who decide one day that they want to sue the Sackler family for their role in everything that has happened. Not because they even want money, but because they want their day in court. Only for them to find out that that right has been taken away from them because a bankruptcy court in White Plains, New York, and a judge in White Plains, New York decided that that was what was fair. Now, the Purdue Pharma bankruptcy and the FTX bankruptcy, frankly, are unique due to the level of villainy of the companies themselves. Most companies that declare bankruptcy aren't evil, per se. And fortunately, because of the Supreme Court, the Sacklers aren't fully getting away with it. But there are still countless examples of the bankruptcy system being manipulated and judges and the courts being outstripped by financial institutions, wealthy individuals, lawyers who have the endless amounts of resources and time to manipulate them. I hope that you have taken that away from this episode, if nothing else. And I hope that at a minimum, you maybe now find bankruptcy a little bit less boring. In any case, folks, that is our episode for today. I hope you did enjoy. And if you did, please subscribe, comment, like, do all the things. And with that, I'll see you next time.